Okay, so the topic for today is make sure to wear the right suit. What will the message be for tonight? Okay, there's a story in the Bible that we find in Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. It's a very interesting story of a king who, at a given time, he was going to throw a wedding feast. And so he invited special guests to join, but on the appointed moment, these guests, for X different reasons, we find out that they did not attend. All right, so we see that eventually the king would go through with his feast. And so he told his servants to go into the streets and invite everyone that they could have find in the streets, the poor, the outcasts, everyone. And so now the feast was set. And so the king was passing through the feast and he saw one individual that was not wearing the wedding garments. Right, we find that in verse 11 and verse 12. And then it continues, verse 13 and 14. We see the story taking an interesting twist. And so the king approached the individual. He said, "How comes you are not wearing the wedding clothes?" He says, "How did you get in here without the wedding clothes?" And so the man was speechless. And the king orders his servants to take this man, to bind him hand and feet and throw him. In other words, kick him out of that wedding feast. Back in ancient times, there was a lot of planning and preparation that was put in place for weddings, not like today. Even though today there's a lot of detail, back then it was much more. And so for this man to show up at a wedding where even the wedding garments was provided and he was not wearing it, it was a great insult to the king who was hosting that important feast. And so we see the relation to that story in regards to salvation is that we must wear the right suit in order for us to enter into heaven, right? We say in the example of Paul, Paul understood the importance of the gospel in his life and the importance of what the gospel had in relations to the suit that God expects from us. We find that Paul was not ashamed of the gospel because in the gospel he found that the righteousness of God was revealed. The righteousness of God was revealed. We find that even Noah understood the importance of the gospel in this time. We see that Noah had a warning message for the people during his time, and none who rejected his message were saved. So we suppose that he preached many heart-wrenching stories, right? And messages, and the necessity that the people would come into the ark so that they could be saved. And also, Paul wrote in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, it says, "He condemned the world because and became heir of righteousness, which is by faith. Without the righteousness of God applied by faith, his preaching, though theoretically true, would never be have won the world." Just so with the everlasting gospel, and we're talking about the everlasting gospel from the three angels' message of Revelation chapter 14. So tonight we're talking about wearing the right suit. We're talking about the gospel. We're talking about righteousness by faith. And this is the message that Paul preached, that Noah preached to the antediluvian world. And it is a message that we must preach today as we accept the message that God has to the Laodicea church, the last church of the seven that would be in existence prior to Jesus coming to this earth, right? What a momentous experience we will have as members of this spiritual Laodicea church. But we see that even though Laodicea had a condition, as they accepted the recommendation that God gave to them, they were to be overcomers, right? The warning message of and righteousness of God. We see the power of the gospel. The righteousness of God must accompany the warning message that we are to give. So several have written me inquiring if the message of justification by faith is the third angel's message, and I have answered. Sister White says, the Review and Herald, it is the third angel's message in its verity. Right, so we see the Laodicea message right here on the screen. Once again, we have the diagnosis the recommendation and what we are studying tonight, we find out that so tonight we studied the gold tried in fire that we may be rich. Last night we studied to anoint our eyes with the eye salve that thou mayest see. And tonight we will be studying the white raiments that we may be clothed, and the shame of our nakedness do not appear. See, the problem with Laodicea is that they had all of these things at their disposal, but God was inviting them to get all of these things from the spiritual sense of it. All right, we just want to go over the overview of the end time events, right? As we see all these events unfolding in the last days. All right, so we start off in 1848 up until Jesus coming, right? We see the Laodicea message that God had for them is that they're lukewarm. All right, at a given point in time, they accept the message of righteousness by faith. We see that with the acceptance of this message, the Laodicean the believers are revived, their spiritual condition is revived. And during that time, we also see the shaking happening. What happens during the shaking is that members who are firm in the faith will stay, others who are not firm will leave, and other people from the outside will come and replace those people who have left, right? And right after that happened, after the shaking, we see God's pouring out the Holy Spirit through the latter rain that will empower and equip his people to give the loud cry. The loud cry is the message that will be given prior to the close of probation, right? And God's people will be sealed. And right after that, we see the 7 last plagues coming down upon this earth. And there's a specific time during that time when it will be considered as Jacob's time of trouble, right? It will be a terrible time in the history of this world that have never been like before. And after this, you know, when everything seems to, everybody seems to lose hope, then we see Jesus coming in that small dark cloud that will eventually come closer and then eventually become brighter and brighter and brighter. And then, you know, the inhabitants of the earth who have not accepted him will run to the mountains, you know, and ask the mountains to fall on them. And the righteous will say, this is our God, like what Isaiah says. We have waited for him, and we will rejoice for his salvation, right? So there were 3 industries in Laodicea, right? We mentioned this already, that made them wealthy, right? And also that was the reason why they had such a spiritual condition, as we see in Revelation chapter 3, verses 14 and onwards, that they said they had need of nothing, right? Because they had a lot of things that was accessible to them. And even, well, but 3 of the things that gave them their recognition in the ancient world was an elaborate banking center, right? In Asia Minor, you know, Laodicea city was strategic in that, you know, it was the center of the then known world in regards to trade with major cities in that region. And so they were able to engage in a lot of business and accumulate wealth, right? Including a gold exchange. So they had a banking center and a gold exchange system. Also, we see in Laodicea, they had a textile center where glass and black wool was woven into garments called trimata that was prized in the Roman world. You know, this was another thing. Laodicea was recognized for this specific product of clothes that was made out of black wool. And I have on a picture on the screen the sheep that produce these black wool. They were black sheep, right? And these were sheep were highly prized for the wool that they produce, and they were all from Laodicea, right? There was this privileged city that had these black sheep. All right, so also they had this major medical school known for worldwide as well, where an eye salve called Phrygian powder was made from a local stone. And last night we spoke a lot about that, right? It was the hot springs from Hierapolis, where it was concentrated with mineral limestone, and they mixed it, the powder and water, and they applied it to the eyes, and people were healed during that time, and a lot of people recognize them for that, right? So we want to focus tonight on this textile center that the Laodicean church had. You know, it was something that made them distinguish among the people in that time. And the message for them that even though they had this specific thing that made them be outstanding to others, Jesus was saying that despite this, they had lacking the true garments of what he wanted to give to them. You see, the Laodicean message was a message to a group of people that were honest in the deception, that had been deceived, right, of their true spiritual condition. And Jesus was inviting them to engage in a genuine and deeper experience with him. All right, so let us get into the message for tonight. The gospel is the end time message. You see, this message that God commanded to be given to the world, the gospel message, it is the third angel's message, which is to be proclaimed with a loud voice and attended with the outpouring of the Spirit in a large measure. This is the testimony that must go throughout the length and breadth of the world. It presents the law and the gospel, binding up the two in a perfect whole. We must note that the Laodicea church will be the church that will be existing in the last days, that will give the three angels message, right? This is a powerful thing that the Laodicea church will be a part of. We see that the gospel of that includes the righteousness by faith was the message that broke the power of the papacy, especially during Martin Luther time. We find that Martin Luther found out that message from the book of Romans, that it says, the just shall live by faith. You see, others may have and did preach righteousness by faith with great power, but the reformer during the Dark Ages did and broke the power of the papacy. But righteousness by faith, binding up the law and the gospel in a perfect whole, is also demanded of those who finish the work of God during our time, especially as we accept the counsel that God has for us during the Laodicea time, the end time church in these last days, right? So this is the message that would close the work. The message of Christ's righteousness is the sound from one end of the earth to the other to prepare the way of the Lord. This is the glory of God, which closes the work of the three angels' message, right? As God invites us to take up his robes of righteousness, you know, and we accept this and make it practical in our lives as we give the message, the loud cry message, the three angels' message. It will be the same message that we invite others to take up Christ's robes of righteousness so that they would be right and justified before God. You see, the message of the three angels, the loud cry of the third angel began with the revelation of this great truth of righteousness by faith. And it will end with the angel of Revelation, chapter 18, uniting his voice with that of the third angel in the final call out of Babylon. We see one of the three angels' messages that the people must come out of her. God is inviting his people to come out of her, my people, right? And like I mentioned last week, there are three people involved in the coming out of Babylon. There is one group that will be giving the message to come out of her, my people. There will be another group that will come out of Babylon, right? And there will be another group still that will remain in Babylon, right? And we don't want to be in the last two groups. We want to be in the first group, right? Because in the first group, we will be blessed because we will be giving the message, right? You could be in the second group too, right? That will be coming out, but we don't want to be in that group because we know that in heaven, there will be no starless crown. So we must be engaged in giving the message of the gospel and helping others to be saved, right? So we see the light of the angels whose glory shall fill the earth. It says, this is the beginning of the light of the angel whose glory shall fill the whole earth, right? Speaking about the loud cry and also the three angels' message and the gospel that will be given during these end times, the gospel of the righteousness by faith. And we see that it is a message that is necessary for us to present, and also it has to do with the eternal warfare that is at hand right now. It says just the doctrine of justification by faith has been lost sight of by many who profess to believe the three angels' message. There is not one in 100 who understands for himself the Bible truth of this subject, that it is so necessary to our present and eternal warfare. And so it is important as individuals that we may dive into this topic and understand it and apply it to our lives so that we could have a clear vision of what it is. You see, there's a problem if we fail to understand the message. It says that it is this failure to understand this vital truth for ourselves that is delaying the coming of the Master. Imagine this. It is a failure to understand this vital truth, the truth of righteousness by faith for ourselves, and to experiencing it that is delaying the coming of our Master, right? We always say that a condition for Jesus to come back is that the gospel will go into all the world, but the gospel will not go into all the world if it does not become a reality for us. So we must make it real for ourselves first. We must make it practical in our experience. We see that it is just here that we are wretched, according to the Laodicea message, miserable, poor, and blind, and naked, and satisfied in our wretchedness. And the reason for this is because the message to the Laodicea church is a spiritual message. And in order for us to understand our true spiritual condition, we must understand the message that God has for that church, which is righteousness by faith, not by works. Remember the message of the Laodicea church, God says, I know thy works, but works goes as far as works can take us. There's a point in our experience where we have to experience what we have with God by faith, right? We must know our spiritual destitution. Those who feel so well satisfied, who know not their spiritual destitution, says that God has a rebuke for them. See, God expects us to know this condition that we have, this spiritual destitution. God expects to know that we are lacking in this area. For he sends us a specific message that reveals it, right? And that is the message to the Laodicea church. And so we must not hide behind ignorance. We see last night that God says, in times of ignorance, God winks. But when we know God will not wink, God will hold us accountable. So God's finger is pointed to all those who ignore the message. And God is saying that we are the man, thou art the man, right? So the promise to study it is the righteousness of Christ that goes before us, and this is the glory of the Lord, which is to be our reward. Okay, we must be shut in with God. What does this mean? In humility and surrender to the word of God and Jesus Christ, we see as we engage in a relationship with him, we become shut in, literally shut in with God. And when we are in this state, Satan cannot reach us. It says here, there is by our side a witness, a heavenly messenger, who will lift up for us a standard against the enemy. He will shut us in the bright beams of the Son of Righteousness. Beyond this, Satan cannot penetrate. He cannot pass the shield of holy light. If we want to be protected in the end times, we must be literally shut in with God in regards to our connection and relationship with him. You see what Satan wants? You see, Satan is exercising all his powers to keep us from seeing and for accepting ourselves this blessed truth. We see that he does not want us to be perfectly shielded from his power, right? So we enter into this next topic of righteousness imputed. See, the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us not because of any merit on our part, but because it is a free gift from God. And this is a precious start. You see, the enemy of God and man is not willing that this truth should be clearly presented, for he knows that if the people would receive it fully, his power would be broken. So how can we clearly present the message? You see, Satan is not willing that this truth should be clearly presented, but we must seek earnestly to God that we may be able to present it clearly. And seek God, we must do this, right? For we can never present it clearly till we have an experience. mental knowledge of it, and it would take all to buy the field. And he demands all. We must get fully on board with God and put everything aside and put him first in order to have power to give this message, to be shut in with him, that we may be empowered to give this message, right? So divided service will not help us in this work. We must be fully on board, right? And we also see that the time is late. See the diagram here on the screen, it presents our lives, right? From the point that we are converted, we see that righteousness of Christ is imputed, and this gives us our title to heaven. The point after our conversion until Jesus comes, we see that righteousness is imparted day by day by day, and this is what gives us our fitness to heaven. It is during this time that our character can be refined, right? And it is an important period of our experience with God. You see, there is need for entire surrender of our heart. See, while God can be just and yet justify the sinner through the merits of Christ, no man can cover his soul with the garments of Christ's righteousness while practicing known sins or neglecting known duty. So it is not just sins that would hinder us, but if we fail to fulfill the duty that God has for us, and the duty that we have is to engage in the work of giving the gospel to others, to experience it, give it to others, right? All right, so there are many names in the church record that have never been soundly converted. Sister Wright wrote in 1900s that there are some people in church that have not been converted members in the church books, right? And this man wrote that 29 years later, he could not understand this, and look at us, 120 plus years later, and still we are in this condition. We have members leaving, right? And that is a sign that these members are not truly converted, because when we are converted, we will see that we have a great work to do, right? And that will be no reason for us to leave, but to press closer to Christ and to press closer to our brothers and sisters so we all could finish the work, right? So we see righteousness is imputed and imparted. The first is our title to heaven, and the second is our fitness to heaven, right? So we see that this whole process is justification by faith, and is a justification by faith in action. So no man can cover his own soul with the garments of Christ's righteousness while practicing known sins or neglecting known duties. All right, so we see the Laodicean condition was that they are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, until they accept the righteousness of Christ. Tonight, I'm making the call to action for all of us, that we may accept Christ's work of justification and sanctification in our salvific experience. We must do our best daily to maintain a living connection with Jesus, right? Every day, we must consecrate our lives to Jesus, and we must engage in the work that he has for us. Also recognize the part that Jesus gave to me in giving the clear message of salvation to others.